Dimitri's leg jittered relentlessly as he stared at the building before him. If he was being honest with himself, he had no idea what time it was. The man hadn't slept in at least 32 hours. Well, not properly. One couldn't really count the time spent waiting for a flight or even on a plane as decent sleep. Not that he could sleep. He was far too angry. Even now, his body craved a good bed and some rest. If only he'd thought to book a hotel room. It was fine. Spending time in America had never been part of his game plan. The mission was to arrive, grab Shura, and go home as soon as they had a flight available. Whatever was happening in this strange country was enough to pull Shura out of his control. She was starting to act up. That wasn't something he was willing to accept. He shook his head violently, willing the sleep out of his eyes and taking whatever thoughts he had with it. It was so hard to focus when he was sitting in this cold and frankly wet place. The trees behind the building were nice. It reminded him of the forest back home. If it hadn't been for Shura's choice of career, as well as Dimitri's own, they never would have left Russia. Part of him wished they hadn't. He craved the seclusion of their old cabin far away in the woods where no one else could get to them. Sure, the town didn't like Shura much, but she liked to stay home anyway, so who cared? Mother never bothered him. Dimitri never really knew why, but their mother avoided him more than she was willing to admit. Anytime he demanded something, she flinched back. Anytime he craved affection, she reached out for him as though she were afraid his very touch would shatter her. Anytime she told him she loved him, it felt as though it was meant to calm him down. He never understood it. As much as he missed their childhood home, he didn't miss his mother tiptoeing around him. Was she even still alive at this point? Without Shura taking care of her, he was sure the woman would have keeled over within the year of them leaving. The last time Shura updated him, their mother was doing surprisingly well. Then again, could it really be considered an update when he'd walked in on Shura having a conversation with her over the phone? There was something his sibling hadn't mentioned, and she'd hung up the phone almost too quickly. The thought of Shura keeping a secret from him pissed him off to no end. He didn't care about what happened to their mother, but Shura was not about to hold information back from him. He pressed her hard, and she broke within minutes, telling him that their mother had been speaking to a new man. Like that would ever happen. As far as he was concerned, she should have been happy with the fact that their father ever loved her at all and been content to be alone for the rest of her days. Movement pulled Dimitri out of his thoughts, and he perked up as he noticed a white van leaving Star Palace. He could see the woman he'd knocked over with the door in the passenger seat and an unfamiliar redhead in the driver's side. However, he couldn't see into the back of the van. It looked like it was made for carrying cargo, so he highly doubted there were seats in the back, but the suspicion that they might be hiding Shura inside still crossed his mind for a moment.
"Wait a minute,"
he muttered to himself. If the van came from the back, that meant there was a back entrance. Why hadn't he thought of that before? He pulled himself up from the curb as fast as he could and rushed to the back of the building. If he did this quickly, he could be back in a taxi on the way to the airport within the hour. He craved his own bed so badly it hurt. The building backed up almost completely to the forest, where there was a single door and nothing around it but a light and a camera. The door, of course, was locked. Upon further inspection, Dimitri found another part of the building with an actual parking lot behind it. Well, a sort of parking lot. It looked as though there was just barely enough room for a truck to back in to make deliveries to the dock, but not much else. There were no other parking spots. The strangest part of the area was the fact that the lot held no boundaries or blockades and dropped straight into a small grass hill that led to a large pond. How many trucks or cars took the turn too quickly and barreled down into the water, he wondered. Again, he shook his thoughts away. He had to focus on the task at hand. The dock had a huge sliding metal door, and one smaller normal door beside it. Just like the last door, both were locked. Unlike the last door, the smaller one was made of wood. From the scraping of the paint, it looked very much like the original one had been damaged somehow and was replaced with a budget door. Dimitri took hold of the handle and jiggled it around to test its strength. The whole thing felt flimsy and cheap.
"There's got to be something out here I can use."
The man's muttering was lost to him. He was so tired that his own thoughts were starting to spill out without him realizing it. Even as he scanned the area, it took him 3 look-throughs to notice the crowbar still leaning against a stack of empty pallets. The overall dock was messy. Plastic from the pallets was strewn about, and stacks of them were off to the side, just barely out of the way from the sliding door. Whoever worked here didn't seem to care about their job. It looked as though they dropped what they were doing and left exactly at the end of their shift.
This will do,"
Dimitri said with a wicked grin. With some difficulty, he managed to wedge the crowbar under the door, yanking and tugging to try and get it to come loose. He grunted and strained, wiggling the door as much as he could. This was a terrible idea, and nothing really came of it. Try as he might, the door wouldn't move. With a growl, he yanked it out and slammed the crowbar into the wood as hard as he could. What he wasn't expecting was that his lashing out would aid his cause. The door dented, and when Dimitri peered closer, he could see the wood starting to splinter.
Oh, you're mine now, you bitch.
He growled, pulling back the bar and once more letting loose on the door. With each impact, the wood began to give way. Dimitri grew more and more desperate to get inside. There it went. He'd made it through a good chunk of the first layer, and it was mostly hollow with a second layer on the other side. There were no thoughts as to if anyone could hear him or not. Frankly, he didn't care. No matter what, he would find a way to force himself inside. The wild man grasped the door handle, dropping the crowbar on the ground with a loud clatter as he began to kick his way in. The sole of his boot crashed through, and the sounds of splintering wood reached his ears as finally there was a hole for him to work with. Dimitri ignored the pain shooting up his leg, shouting as he continued his rampage. Finally, the door split in half, and there was a hole large enough for him to squeeze through. Dimitri let out a laugh of triumph. He'd done it. He'd burst through. Nothing and no one would keep him away from Shura. He'd make sure of that. He took the crowbar from the ground and squeezed himself inside, too busy internally celebrating to care about the wood swiping across the skin of his cheek. Even the feeling of the blood trickling down his skin was lost to him. He was focused entirely on one thing and one thing alone. Shura. Everything else could wait. He was in. That was all that mattered. Though the sight of an axe on the wall helped lift his mood far more than it should have. The crowbar was abandoned in favor of the axe. With a wide grin, he caressed the handle in excitement. Now, there was no way Shura could say no to him. The painter, meanwhile, was resting peacefully in Zavi's room. Under the watchful eye of Sergei the jellyfish, the two relaxed against the purple sheets. Many soft kisses had been shared, and she felt safer than she ever had in the bot's many arms. Was this what it felt like? Was this home? The only time she felt anything even close to this sensation was when she was alone in her room with her cat, when she didn't have to fear someone judging her or ordering her around, when she could just lay there, petting his soft fur and feeling his purr in the darkness. This was similar, but different. Was this what it felt like when people were in love? The thoughts swirled around in her mind as she lay there in her sleepy haze. Every time Zavi stroked her hair, she felt a swell of affection deep in her heart. For a long time, she felt herself falling in and out of sleep. She almost didn't notice Zavi's arms tightening around her, or the sensation of him sitting up. She almost didn't notice the sounds coming from down the hallway, or the sound of a familiar voice calling her name. Almost. Shura's eyes flew open as a loud cry sounded from outside. She didn't hear herself gasp. All she heard was pounding on the door.
Shura! Are you there? Get your ass out here!
Dimitri screamed. The man wiggled the door handle, ignoring the splinters in his hands from dealing with previous doors. Zavi's room didn't have a lock. None of the bots' rooms had locks on them. Zavi had wanted privacy tonight. After calming Shura, he'd wedged a chair under the door to keep anyone from interrupting their time together. This decision had saved the painter. At least for now. It bought them time. Shura whimpered, trying to cover her own ears with her hands. As quiet as she thought she was, her noise still made it to Dimitri. The man grinned, giving out a kind of laugh she'd never heard out of him before, and with a soft,
"Found you,"
he brought down the axe against the door. Shura shrieked, and Zavi stood with her cradled in his arms. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing he could do. How was he supposed to keep her safe against a deranged maniac with an axe when there was no windows and no other doors? The noise of the axe splintering the wood was almost too much for his sensors to bear. Zavi could feel Shura trembling in his arms, and her heart rate was through the roof. The roof. Through the roof! The memory of the ball bursting through the ceiling tile flickered back into his mind, and suddenly there was hope. The medical bot stood on the bed, trying with some difficulty to balance as he reached up and managed to push one of the ceiling tiles up and out of the way.
Shura,
He cooed, keeping his voice soft as he tilted her head up to look at him.
listen to me. I'm going to lift you up into the ceiling, okay? I want you to crawl up there as far as you can toward the maintenance room.
The maintenance room?
She squeaked, trying to comprehend what was going on.
Yes,
Zavi said.
it's an easy exit.
Also, with any luck, maybe Wesley would come back soon from the hospital. There was a chance Shura could immediately get into the van with him and leave. If not, at least she could get outside. There was a forest she could run through with houses on the other side, or there was El Taki's. The little bot knew who she was and could let her inside and call the police while Zavi was dealing with Dimitri. The more he thought about it, the more Zavi realized Taki was their safest option.
Get to the maintenance bay, get outside, and run to El Taki's across the street. He'll take care of you there. Just tell him to call for help.
Zavi instructed.
Just be very careful. It's probably really dusty up there, and the roof isn't all that stable. Try to balance on the frames, not the ceiling tiles, okay?
But Xavier, what about...
Shura's words were interrupted as the bot's lips pressed against her own. She let out a squeak of surprise, and then a soft sigh. Even in this moment of pure anxiety, Zavi was still trying to comfort her.
You can do this,
He whispered against her lips.
Just get to Taki, and I'll see you soon. Everything will be okay.
All Shura could do was nod as she was lifted into the ceiling. Zavi was right. It was dusty up there. But he was also right about something else. They'd see each other soon. The ceiling creaked as she tried her best to balance on the frames. This was going to be slow going, but she was sure she'd manage. Zavi managed to slip the ceiling tile back into place and sit down before the axe finally made a full strike through the door. Dimitri didn't sound human anymore. He growled like an animal, yanking at the wood and widening the hole with the sharp metal in his hands.
Shura!
He screamed out, trying to see into the room.
When I get my hands on you, I'm going to...
Zavi gave a mock shriek, covering up his body with his hands as though he'd been exposed.
Can't a guy get a little privacy? This is my dressing room.
He called out.
You!
Dimitri hissed.
Where is Shura?
She's not here.
Zavi lied. He stopped himself. If he lied and told Dimitri that she'd left along with Wesley and Cricket, there was a chance the man would leave and see her running for El Taki's. He couldn't have that. He needed to keep Dimitri in the building until the police arrived.
She couldn't sleep, so she wanted to go for a walk by herself.
He said, flourishing his hand dramatically.
Where?
Dimitri demanded.
You're gonna pay for that door, right?
Zavi asked, avoiding the question.
I don't know how I'll be able to deal with the lack of privacy.
He leaned back against the bed, dramatically pulling a hand to his forehead.
I'll be overwhelmed by the fans. You don't understand. They can't get enough of me.
Dimitri let out a string of Russian that Zavi was pretty sure meant, "You fucking bitch," though he was pretty sure he was missing an update or two for that language. It didn't matter. This is what he wanted. The angrier the man got, the less likely Dimitri was to leave. He'd stay here, rage at Zavi, and Shura would be given enough time to escape. That was all he wanted, even if it meant his own body was destroyed in the process. Dimitri was seeing red. The man yanked at the door, bringing down his axe against it as hard as he could to try and widen the hole enough for him to move the door out of the way. Zavi relished in watching Dimitri break down to his basic instincts, and a wide smirk made its way across his lips.
Hey!
The new voice wiped the smile right off Zavi's face. He could see Dimitri struggling through the hole in the door, and as he yelled out in frustration, Fairy's voice rang out through the air.
Y'all okay in there?
Oh, no.
Zavi whispered.
No.
He hadn't factored in Fairy and Mirage. He'd completely forgotten that Fairy didn't go into a sleep mode when she was charging. She was fully awake. Mirage was a mystery. He had no idea how the Puppet Master charged, or if they would even come out of their room if they heard noise.
Let me go, Suka.
Dimitri demanded.
You calm your britches.
Fairy said.
I don't know who you think you are or what you think you're doing here, but you are not hurting my friends.
Zavi could barely see the two as he stood up from the bed. From the looks of things, Fairy had wrapped her arms around Dimitri to keep him from moving. Like a true cowgirl, she knew how to lasso. But now he could hear the sounds of a struggle. The bot scrambled to the door, trying to come to her aid when he heard a sickening sound. Metal against metal. Fairy screamed as Dimitri broke loose, bringing his axe down on her shoulder.
Fairy!
Zavi called, trying to wrench the door open. It wouldn't budge. At some point, Dimitri had axed part of the lock, and now the door was stuck closed. All Zavi could do was yank at the wood, pulling pieces away as fast as he could, while the horror played out before him. Every swing of Dimitri's axe severed sensors and wires. One of Fairy's arms clattered to the ground, and then the other, freeing him from her grasp. Her body hit the floor, and she sat there in pure shock. Her system was trying to recalibrate itself, and her sense of balance. An amber-colored fluid leaked from her arms. Her eyes flickered, and everything inside of her was trying its best to stay active.
You bastard!
Xavi yelled. He finally managed to pull the rest of the door off its hinges when the sight of Burgundy reached his sensors. There was Mirage, holding Eerie and trying to take in the sight of what was happening before them. Xavi had been trapped. Fairy was sitting in a crumpled heap on the floor, and there was an unfamiliar man with an axe responsible for all the damage. Dimitri lashed out before they could react, grasping at Eerie's little body and yanking her out of Mirage's arms. He didn't know what she was, but he was through playing around.
Where is Shura?
He demanded, waving the axe in Mirage's direction.
Give Eerie back!
Mirage screamed in panic.
Oh, is this important to you?
Dimitri asked, wiggling Eerie around in the air.
Calm down now.
Xavi tried to soothe them both.
Maybe we can just talk about this.
This was dangerous. To Mirage, Eerie was an actual person. She wasn't just some wooden doll that could be replaced. She was their whole world.
No, you don't get to tell me to calm down. Just tell me where she is.
Dimitri replied.
Give her back to me!
Mirage begged, their voice far higher than Xavi was used to hearing it. This was all going wrong. It was a simple plan. Get Shura out, keep Dimitri distracted, get him arrested. 2 miscalculations and everything was unraveling faster than he ever could have imagined. If he moved, Dimitri would break Eerie and they'd lose Mirage. The puppet master was a wild card in this equation. Fairy was down for the count, and he had no idea how far away Shura had gotten at this point. How was he supposed to handle this situation? Unfortunately, Dimitri made a move before he could fully compute what to do.
I'm through playing around with all of you.
The Russian man swung the puppet in the air, and things seemed to run in slow motion for Xavi. Eerie hit the wall, and the sound of wood cracking rang out through the hallway. Her little body flailed, and dread ran through his sensors. He could see Fairy's eyes widen, and Mirage's whole body shuddered.
Where is my...
Dimitri's words were interrupted by the pain ripping through his entire body. Mirage's scream was damn near deafening, and it took a long moment for anyone to realize that they had plunged their whittling knife deep into Dimitri's side. Fairy leaned back, kicking the back of his knee so hard she almost broke it. The man's axe clattered to the floor, and as he fell, Fairy managed to catch Eerie between her knees, curling around her to try and keep her safe.
Go to hell.
The bot shouted, ready to defend the puppet with her life just as she had been for Xavi and Shura. Mirage's body slumped forward, their neck clicking in an uncanny manner as their face switched from one to the other in rapid succession. Xavi didn't know who to go to first, Mirage or Fairy. He didn't get to choose. The puppet master snatched the axe off the floor, lunging at Dimitri with all they had. The man cursed, barely able to get out of the way before the axe came crashing down into the cheap laminate flooring.
You hurt Eerie! You hurt Fairy!
They screamed, struggling to pull the metal back out of the ground.
You...
With a grunt, they managed to wriggle it free. A manic laugh left their body, and as their face smiled wide, they threw themselves into every motion. Everything was devolving into absolute chaos. Mirage seemed to have lost control completely. Xavi found himself struggling to help Fairy up. Between her bottom size and the fact that she was losing power fast, she was basically dead weight, not to mention the panic of Mirage managing to hurt Dimitri. The man deserved it, that was for sure, but if the bot hurt him any more than the stab to the side or killed him, they were going to be dismantled and shut down. Who is he kidding? Xavi knew Mirage was most likely already going to be shut down for hurting the asshole in the first place. It didn't matter if the initial strike was in self-defense. All the marks on the walls and the floor from Mirage's swings weren't something they were going to be able to pass off as anything other than murderous intent. Mirage was going to be thrown away, just like Xavi himself had been. Should he grab the smaller bot? Should he keep helping Fairy? Had Shura made it out yet? Had she gotten hurt climbing around up there? There were too many variables. Too many possibilities flooded his mind. Humans often had very specific fear responses. The most well-known responses were fight or flight. There was another, much less well-known reaction. Freeze. Xavi was freezing, and he hated himself for it. There were so many options that his system was refusing to choose any of them. Fairy slipped, and in his haze of trying to think things through, the two of them fell. She landed on top of him, and Eerie rattled as she hit the ground. The puppet lay lifeless on the floor. Meanwhile, Zavi found that he couldn't seem to lift himself up with the weight of Fairy's body on top of him. He was so caught up in everything going on around him that he didn't hear the creaking of the ceiling above them. Shura's body moved slowly through the ceiling. All of this was a balancing act. If she placed her body the wrong way, everything under her threatened to give way. The anxiety welling up inside of her felt like it would bubble up and boil over at any minute. Her chest was tight. She couldn't breathe. The sheer amount of dust didn't help. The gravity of the situation at hand made her feel like she was being crushed. It was so dark. The painter wondered as she trudged through the dirty ceiling if she was even going the right way. There was so much noise down below. The screaming, the thunking, and the horrifying sound of metal hitting walls and floors had her mind spinning. She wanted to see if her friends were okay. The artist managed to make a turn over what she assumed was the correct hallway. Her arm brushed against something strangely squishy. It rolled over, releasing a horrid smell. In truth, she wasn't sure how she hadn't noticed the stench earlier. Whatever it was falling apart and rotting. It was the horrible, sickly sweet, overpowering scent of death. Panic rushed through her, and as Shura tried to scoot away, the ceiling trembled below her. It shifted, groaned, and dropped with terrifying speed. With a loud noise of fright, Shura felt her body careening downward. The entire ceiling collapsed to the floor so hard it knocked the wind out of her. She lay there gasping for air, trying to comprehend if she'd broken anything. The debris below her had drawn blood, but the adrenaline was kicking in at full blast. If there was pain, she couldn't feel it. Her noise hadn't gone unnoticed. The entire group stopped, turning to look in the direction the ruckus had come from. Zavi could feel the terror rising within him as he saw the dots connecting in Dimitri's brain.
Fairy, get off!
He called, trying to push the heavier bot off of him. His movements were in vain. Fairy could no longer properly balance herself. While she tried her best to roll off him, Dimitri bolted forward. He shoved his way past Mirage, taking delight in hearing the bot stumble into the wall. The pain of the gaping wound in his side felt like nothing at all as he rounded the corner just in time to see Shura getting to her feet. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Shura felt like her world was ending. Dimitri's face was more horrifying than anything she had ever seen. His grin was too wide, and his eyes were too large. She felt like a prey animal being stared down by a drooling predator. Any hint of her baby brother was gone. The only thing in front of her now was a monster, a mirror image of how she'd perceived her father. She turned to run, but her moment of hesitation was all it took. Dimitri lashed out, grasping Shura's hair and yanking back to keep the artist in place.
You're not going anywhere.
He hissed, giving a hard tug.
Nowhere but home with me.
Dimitri, stop! Please!
Shura begged, tears filling her eyes. Excitement welled up inside of Dimitri. He'd always held back, kept himself from touching her aside from threats here and there. He'd always been afraid to tarnish her. But this feeling, seeing her trembling before him, looking up at him with those big, pretty eyes and begging was too much for him to handle. The mask had cracked. There was no holding back anymore. With a laugh, he pulled her to the left, and then to the right, as hard as he could, to ram her into the wall. Shura's cries sent his blood rushing hot and heavy to a place where it never should. Not for his sister.
You're mine. Do you hear me? Mine!
The hair in Dimitri's hand fell slack, and Shura fell to the ground. It took a long moment for Dimitri to realize that the axe Mirage had formerly been holding was lodged into the wall. The hair in his hand was no longer attached to the painter. Shura gasped for breath, fighting to see through her tears. Her body moved on its own, managing to stand and run as fast as her legs could take her. The maintenance bay was so close. The only thing she could do to keep from thinking about what was going on around her was to repeat the plan in her head. Get to maintenance, go outside, run to El Taki's, ask for help. Get to maintenance, go outside, run to El Taki's, ask for help. Over and over again, she repeated it in her mind in an attempt to ignore the monster behind her. Dimitri's footsteps were so loud. She didn't hear or see Mirage trying to pull the axe back out of the wall and failing. She didn't hear Zavi calling out for her to keep running as he tried to follow. It was only Dimitri's pounding footsteps and her own thoughts. Get to maintenance, go outside, run to El Taki's, ask for help. Her chest felt tighter than she'd ever felt it before. Her lungs burned as the cold air from outside rushed inside. The door was finally open. Freedom was right there in front of her. The feeling of her shoes hitting the pavement gave her hope. She was almost there. And then it all came crashing down around her. Cold, hard metal pummeled into her back. Pain branched out and shocked her to her core, making her steps falter. The parking lot ended, and instead, she found herself toppling down into the grass. Her vision blurred and her body rolled. All she could taste was dirt and the dew of the early morning still forming on the blades of grass. At this point, she wasn't even sure if she was screaming. Her body had accepted its fate and gone completely limp. That was until she hit the water. The cold, dark liquid of the pond enveloped her entirely. She fell into shock, and for a moment she couldn't move. Water rushed into her mouth, and Shura fought against herself. The painter coughed and sputtered the instant her head broke the surface, trying desperately to breathe as she clung to the edge of the pond. One good breath was all she was allowed to take. A pair of strong hands wrapped around her neck, and before she knew it, Shura was once more gasping for air.
Enough of this!
Dimitri growled.
You're coming home with me, or not at all! You hear me, Shura?
The painter sputtered, trying to push him away. His strength was immeasurable. She pushed with all her strength, but she felt as small as a child in that moment. A small, helpless, weak child.
Dimitri, please.
Shura pleaded.
Oh, that's right. Beg.
He said with a grin.
Dimi.
Shura!
Mirage's voice rang out through the air, calling her attention away from her brother just long enough for her to see a knife whizzing through the air towards them. She wasn't sure how she managed, but somehow, some way, Shura reached her hand out and caught the handle of the spinning blade. Mirage's whittling knife plunged deep into Dimitri's neck with all the strength Shura could manage. Warm blood spilled forward, blossoming red against the canvas of the dark night. They stayed like that, his hands around her neck and both of her hands holding the knife in place. Was this it? Were they both going to die like this? Together, locked in an eternal struggle, Dimitri trying to keep control over her and Shura desperately trying to break free. It was oddly fitting, she decided. The world started to go black, and Shura could swear she felt the life starting to drain out of her. They would die together, and the earth would swallow them whole. The artist closed her eyes and bid the world farewell. But the world had other plans. The sound of metal hitting flesh and bone sounded off in her head as loud as a gunshot, and suddenly she could breathe again. Air rushed back into her, and her vision returned. Dimitri's body was slack against the grass, his eyes distant and glassy. Grasping the knife harder, Shura pulled it down, slicing through his Adam's apple like a piece of fruit on a hot summer's day. Now Shura's eyes met a different pair. There stood Xavi, looking more frightened and distraught than she'd ever seen him before. In his hands was a metal pipe, the very same one Dimitri had apparently used to strike her down. Blood dripped off its edge where it had collided with her former brother's skull. Xavi dropped the pipe, and Shura felt the knife slip out of her hands, now lost to the waters below. It was over. Dimitri was gone.